Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about dates quite a lot. So we're going to spend some time talking about how to use dates in Jadu Central in terms of using dates in forms, how you can use the date component, and how you can use logic to reformat dates. And we'll also look at how you can use case dates in Jadu Connect, so how you can generate them and how you can use them in rules and other elements of the platform. So I've done a bit of preparation. So I've got a form here that I've built that will let me demonstrate the different elements of dates within Jadu Central. So just to talk briefly about the date component itself. So within Jadu Central, when you're building a form page template, there's a date component. It effectively provides a date picker for the user when they're completing the form. But there are a few things that you can configure within it to determine what dates you want to capture. So you can set it to default to the current day if you want to. You can set it to default to a specific date if that's relevant to the form that you're developing. You can set it to only accept dates in the future, or only accept dates in the past. If you choose either of these, you can also limit how far back or how forwards you want to provide dates in the form. So for example, if I select only accept dates in the past, I could say I only want to accept dates going back 28 days. There is a link here that will give you details about other sort of relative date formats you can use. So you can use things like days, months, years, hours, minutes, weekdays, anything that's relevant. You can set up a specific date range so that users are only presented with dates within that date range to pick from. And then the last sort of configuration option that's specific to the date picker is you can select to only accept weekdays. So you can prevent someone selecting a weekend date if it's a form that's only relevant to days of the week. The behavior of the date picker is that it will present the user with the date in the date format based on their browser configuration. So chances are if you're in the UK and you're filling it out, you'll get it in UK format. So you'll get day, month, year. If someone was filling in that form in the US, they would get US format. So they would get month, day, year. But the output of the date picker is always the same. So it always outputs in what's called universal date format. So universal date format is always year, month, and day. So obviously in some instances, that's not necessarily something you're going to want to present to a user. It's useful if you're integrating with other platforms in that because it's using universal date format, it's easy to push a date into another platform. But certainly if you were presenting that date to the user, say in an email confirmation or anything like that, you're not necessarily going to want it to display in universal date format because it's not something that people tend to use on a day-to-day basis. So there is some logic that you can use within forms as well. So I've gone and built in sort of a number of different logics here. They're all using the same type of predefined logic, which is what we call date value. So this allows you to separate elements of your date, and then you can use something like literal logic to reconfigure that date to present it back to a user. So as an example here, I've got a bit of logic to return the day of the week. So this will return the actual name of the day or the abbreviation for the day. Other options you have here are the actual day itself, so the date, so the month, So it'll return the abbreviation of the month, the year, and actually the week of the year as well for the date that you've picked. So in this example, I've pointed my logic at the question where I'm asking someone to pick a date. I've input what the date format is that's generating. There are a number of different options here depending on what the field is that you're using to capture that date. It may be that you're using just a text field, or it may be that you're pulling something back from a booking. So you've got, formats that include hours, minutes, and seconds as well. But because I'm using the date component, I've just pointed it at the universal date format. And then I've selected which of the 5 formats I want to return, in this case, day of the week, and then save that. And I've set up exactly the same for the day, the month, the week of the year, and the year itself. So these will obviously separate off the elements of the date. So what I've then done is I've added a piece of literal logic where I can take the results of these logics and effectively reconfigure them to provide a reformatted date. So in this case, I've dropped in the day of the week logic, the day, the month, and the year, and then between each of them, I've added a text block with a space in it. So if I go into my form, what I've done on my second page, I've just added some placeholders so you can see how that works. So I'm just going to add in the last one. So let's add in week of the year. If I save that, so what we should be able to see when I complete the form is when I go to the second page of the form, you'll see what the outputs of all of those different bits of logic are. So I'm just going to drop my email in. And then I've got my date picker configured, so I'll pick a date. Let's pick next Monday. And then when I go next, you'll see here, so I've got the original date. So this is the date output from the date picker, which, as you can see, is in that universal date format. The day of the week logic has returned Monday. The day logic's returned the 15th. Month logic's returned my abbreviation for April. I've got my year, which week of the year it is. And then you can see here at the bottom my literal logic that's pulling those components together and reconfiguring that date in a more sort of user-friendly output. Even though the date is output from the date picker by default in universal date format, when the user gets to the final completion page of the form where it summarizes their responses, it will present that date in a user-friendly format. But if, for example, you were passing this date into Jadu Connect, this is the format that it would appear in. So if I go next to go to my sort of final completion page, you can see it is presenting that date in a user-friendly format. So the date component is literally just a date picker. If you wanted to do something sort of more detailed, so potentially say you were building a form to enable bookings or anything like that, then you would use say potentially the booking element within Jadu Central, which is a slightly different form component that allows you to use an integration with Office 365 calendars so that you can actually present sort of things like appointments, and you can set it up so it only provides the user with appointment dates that are free for them to book. But that's potentially a subject that would be for a whole other masterclass. That we can get quite involved with that one. So just before I move on to sort of the Connect elements of dates, are there any questions about sort of dates in Central that anyone has? Okay, someone would like a booking masterclass. Yeah, Brooke, that's fine. I'm sure we can set that up as one of the next masterclasses. We've got a couple more plans, but what we're probably going to be looking at from then on is looking to see what you all would like to run these classes on. So we quite like to get some ideas from the customer base in terms of what you'd like to know more about or what you need sort of more guidance and help with. So if people want bookings, we can quite happily do bookings. I'm just going to go in and submit my form. I've actually linked this form to create a case in Jadu Connect. And I'm actually passing my date into a date field in Jadu Connect. So let me just submit my form. So if I jump to Jadu Connect, let me just refresh my filter. We've now got my case that I've just created, which will literally just include my date that I've picked in my calendar and my email address and a date that's been added. So let me jump in and show you how I've set things up in here. So in terms of the date, I've passed the date from my form into a date field in Connect. I could pass it into a text field, but more often it's useful to pass it into a date field because you can use dates in a number of different ways in Connect. The one thing you will notice as well is that it's actually presented it in sort of a more user-friendly format. So it's not using the universal date format. If I'd passed it just straight into a text field, it would have presented it in universal date format. Obviously, an alternative approach could be I could pass my sort of reconfigured date using my logic into a text field, which would have a different output. Can you return an age from a date field? You can. You have to build some custom logic, though, to do it. We can certainly let you know, Amit, about how you can look at calculating an age from a date field. I'm sure I've got that documented somewhere, so I can dig that out for you. So in terms of my date field in Connect, if I go to workflow and fields, let me show you how I've set up my field. So I've literally gone in, specified a name, selected what type of field it is, and I've made it available to all services and all roles. So, and I've done the same. I've created a number of date fields in here. Let me go back to my case. So I've got a date here that I've passed in. So this is a value that's been captured against the case. Now within Connect, we also have what we call case dates. So you can see here it's added a date. So it's done a date calculation and created an SLA date of the 23rd of April. So let me show you how that all works. So within settings in Connect, you have a little section called communication. And this lets you build dates that can be calculated based either on a standard system date or a date that you're capturing in a date field. So I've got a few that I've created in here for today. So I've created a field called expiry date. So this is a case date. So it's demo expiry date. It's based on whatever date's being captured in my date field. So if I go into a new tab and just open my case again. So this will be the date that's being captured here in the field. And it's based on that date plus 0 days. So it might be, I don't know, let's imagine this was a resident parking permit case. This could potentially be my expiry date for my permit. So I've used that to calculate an expiry date. So this generates a system date that we can then use to trigger potential actions in the platform. I've also created a reminder date. So again, if we're imagining this is a sort of a resident parking permit case, we've got the expiry date of the permit. What we probably want to do is before that date, we want to send the resident a reminder that they need to go in and renew their permit. So I'm generating another date called reminder date that's based on whatever I've captured in that demo date field minus 2 days. I've got a calculation that's working out an SLA date. So I've based this on current date and time. There are a few things to be aware of when you're calculating dates. Now, in theory, you could generate an SLA date based on the date that the case is created. But there are a number of reasons why you might not want to do that. If you choose to use the date that the case is created, that date will be generated for every single case that's ever raised. And in some instances, that date might not be relevant to individual cases. So for example, I've got 2 examples of SLA dates in here, one that's 10 days and another one that's 5 days. Obviously, I want to be able to pick and choose which of those dates to use within a particular case or which are generated for a particular case. So if I've selected to base them on the date that the case is created, for every case I ever create, it's going to generate a 10-day SLA date and a 5-day SLA date, which potentially doesn't make sense. And if those dates were then both visible to a user, that could potentially end up being confusing. So what I tend to do is base these dates on the current date and time. So what I can do is when I generate my case, I can set a rule to actually calculate that date at that point. And it also makes it easier if I need to recalculate the SLA date at all. So if I've got a process that involves several steps and I want to recalculate the SLA at each step of the process, if I base it on current date and time, then that helps me to do that. If I base it on the date the case was created, each time I recalculate it, it's going to give me the same date because it's going to be based on the date the case was created. So current date and time gives you a bit more leeway in terms of generating dates and recalculating them. So I've got my 2 SLA dates, and then a bit like my reminder date for my customer, I've created an SLA warning date, which is based on a field called SLA date minus 1 weekday. So this is basically saying, day before the SLA is due, let's send a notification internally to warn someone that the SLA is about to expire. So I've got a number of case dates that I've created that I can do various things with. I can push those dates into fields within the case, and I can use them to trigger rules, and I can use rules to recalculate those dates if I need to. So in terms of my workflow for the demo, let me show you how I'm using those dates. So if I go to my rules, I've got a case creation rule here. So when my case is created, I've set it to recalculate a number of dates. So I've set it to calculate the expiry date. I've set it to calculate a reminder date, to calculate an SLA date. And then because my SLA warning date is based on the SLA date case field, what I'm doing is I'm actually pushing the SLA date into an SLA date field in the case. What this lets you do is it gives you a sort of bit more control over how you use SLA dates. So if you do have a number of SLA dates, and you potentially want to actually hide the case dates themselves from end users who are managing and viewing those cases, but you maybe on the basis that maybe you might be getting multiple dates that do a similar thing that might be confusing, you could actually push any of those dates into a field in the case specifically, to make it more obvious that what the context of that date is. So if I've got a case, maybe in my system I've set it up so that my initial SLA is always based on the date the case is created. I've got 5 different examples of that set up. What I could do is pick the one that's relevant to that particular case type and push that generated date into a field in the case, so it's really obvious what the SLA date is and the user doesn't see 5 random SLA dates on the details tab. So what I'm doing is calculating my SLA date, pushing that into a field, and then using the value of that field to calculate my SLA warning date. So if I go into my case and go to the details tab, you can see here are the case dates that have been generated. So I've got my SLA date, which is the date that I've pushed into my SLA field. I've got my expiry date that's been generated based on my expiry date field. I've got my reminder date that's been calculated based on whatever this date is minus 2 days. And then I've got my SLA warning date, which is based on whatever's been pushed into the SLA date field minus 1 day. So you can see if I look at my SLA date here, it's been pushed into a field. And then from that, it's calculated what the warning date should be. So I've got that initial rule that generates all of the case dates that I need it to do. Yeah, there may be other things that I need to happen when the case is created. So I might want it to, also send an email to the customer or to the internal users. I've only just included the dates in here for clarity for today's demo. Now I've got those dates generated, I can start using them in different ways in the case. So what I might want to do is set up a rule that sends a warning to an internal user if that case hasn't been closed and the SLA date's due. So I could create a new rule. Let's call it email SLA warning. So my trigger is going to be a date. So this will give me a list of all the dates in the system. Somewhere in here, I will have my SLA warning date. So I'll select that. So my rule is effectively saying when it reaches that date, and I'm going to say, and case status is not closed, then what I want to do is send an email using my SLA warning template that I've created as an email template to, let's say, internal staff users. So anyone who's assigned to that case or is part of a group assigned to that case, let's say. So assigned users and groups. So when it gets to a day before the SLA and the case hasn't been dealt with, it's going to send a warning to say, this case is about to breach its service level agreement. Can someone please go in and deal with it? In terms of SLAs, what I might also want to do is set up a rule to set a flag on a case to indicate if it has breached its SLA. So I could set up a new rule. Let's call it SLA breach. So in this case, I'm going to choose the date trigger, and I'll choose whichever SLA I'm using for this particular workflow, which is my example 1. So I'm going to say when it reaches that date, and again, the case status isn't closed, then what I want to do in this instance is set a case value. And I've got an SLA status case value. So I want to set that as missed. So when it reaches the SLA date, if the case hasn't been dealt with, it's going to set a flag on the case to say that it's missed its service level agreement. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in here about bank holidays. At the moment, there is no way of taking into account bank holidays. In terms of Connect, there's no real logic to dates in Connect. So in terms of Jadu Central, you could, if you were using something like a booking component, you could block bank holidays out, but there's not really anything you can do in relation to dates with them. Obviously, the platform is not solely a UK platform, so and bank holidays will vary for different areas of the UK as well. I don't know if there's any particular plans around bank holidays yet. I can check with the product owners to see if there's anything potentially on the roadmap, but there's nothing specific that handles them at the moment. In terms of, so we've got another question about needing central version 2 for some of these functions. No, you shouldn't need that for any of these functions. As long as you've got the latest, not necessarily the latest, but the new form builder, as opposed to our legacy form builder, you'll have all of those date functions in there. All of these features in Connect are there as well. So that none of these are new features really. They've been there for a few years. Okay. So in terms of my rules, I've got an email to send a warning internally if something's about to breach its SLA, and I've got a rule that will set a flag on a case if it does breach its SLA. The last one I'm going to create in here as a rule is I could set up a rule that said send a renewal reminder to the customer. So again, I'll choose my date. So I choose my demo reminder date, and I will choose my action, send an email, my renewal reminder, and I'll send it to my email field where I've captured the customer's email in my case. And then finally, what I might want to do if this was a sort of permit type case type is I might want to use my expiry date to automatically close that case if the permit hasn't been renewed, for example. So I might have a new rule that says something like, so it's going to trigger a transition, close case. So I'll say in this instance, when I reach my expiry date and the case status isn't open, say closed. So it's not either of these two statuses. So it's maybe, it's a permit that's in progress, or due for renewal, or whatever my status might be in that example. Then I can set this to apply a transition to close the case. So using my dates, I've got my first case creation rule that triggers and recalculates all of those dates that I need to manage my case. I've then got various rules that do very specific things in terms of the workflow. So I'm sending a renewal reminder to the customer, an SLA warning to an internal user. I'm closing the case if it's not renewed, and I'm setting an SLA breach flag on the case if it reaches its expiry date and it's not been dealt with. Sorry, reaches its SLA date and it's not been dealt with. So one thing I'd normally recommend in terms of SLAs is, obviously, I mentioned you can't take into account bank holidays, but I would normally base it on weekdays. So it's slightly more accurate than just basing it on days where you might end up with weekends and things like that for your SLAs. But any other questions about dates so far in Connect? So the last thing I was just going to show you quickly is how you can use dates on your dashboard. So if I go to my cases dashboard, you can see I've created a filter to show me all my cases that I'm generating for this demo. And you can see that effectively I've added a couple of columns. One showing the SLA date using just the date field value, and one showing the SLA date using the date value itself. So this is the field, this is the case date. Obviously, they show the same date, but one thing to be aware of is if you actually use the case date itself on your dashboard, it does give you the ability to reorder them, sort of from oldest to latest or latest to oldest, whichever you prefer, whereas you can't do that with the date field. So taking it a step further with the dashboard, because I've got my rule that sets a flag if a case has missed its SLA, you could add extra things in here. So you could, I could add an additional filter by SLA status. So I could say I want to show me a list of all my cases of this type that have missed their SLA. At this point, I'm glad because there's none of them, but it could give me a filter that I could save and reuse as a way of monitoring and reporting on that as well. So any questions about dates or anything that we've run over today? So hopefully that's useful information. Everyone's very quiet. Okay. So obviously, if you do have any, oh, we've got questions. Hey. Using dates as a repeatable question. So you've got the date picker in the repeatable question itself. There isn't really an easy way of doing it with repeatable questions, I don't think. What you could potentially do is look at some way of maybe using the substring logic if that question's at the end of the row or at the beginning of the row, to split the date off and then use the logic that I showed you to reformat it. But yeah, that is a tricky one if you're using dates in a repeatable question. It might be in that instance that you might, rather than using the date picker, you could use a text field with date validation on it. So if I just jump into back to my form. Just sign back in. So if I'm doing a repeatable question, rather than using the date picker, what I might do instead is use a text field. Just put some random question in, date of birth, and then I could use validation for my date format. So I can make that required. I could put some placeholder text in there. And do that instead. So it will validate the format of the date for you and force someone to input relevant date. And then obviously whatever they input as the value in the text field, that format will be what's passed through into Connect. Okay. Yeah, so Paul's dropped the comment in, be useful when we can have non-working days. Yeah, so we'll check with the product teams to see if there's any plans for that on the roadmap. Obviously, it would potentially require a functionality change because working days are going to differ, from area to area, but also potentially from organization to organization as well. So it's so I'll check and see if there's any plans around that for you. Okay. Any other questions before we finish up for today? So Rob made a suggestion, about having a Masterclass Slack channel. I'm sure that's something that could be set up on the customer Slack that we have. If you leave that with me, I'll look at that for you. Any final questions before we finish up? Okay. Well, thank you for everyone's time today. I think our next masterclass, you'll be sent out details of, is going to be on data retention. So hopefully that'll be useful. We'll look at that both in terms of Jadu Central Forms and Jadu Connect. Thanks very much, everyone.